Welcome to episode 4 of Critical Role Demystified. In this series, I recap an episode of Critical Role and see what lessons we can learn from the show and apply to our own games. This time, we're talking about the 4th episode of the Vox Machina campaign, Attack on the Duergar Warcamp. This is the first episode with Ashley Johnson, but Laura is absent for a good chunk of the beginning of the episode, because she was filming Titan's Grave for Geek and Sundry. This episode is a funny one because there's a lot of little lessons we can learn, so I'm going to pepper them in throughout this episode. The party has recovered their new ally, an exiled mind flayer named Clarota. They decide to sleep for the night in the ruined goblin village, a little bit far away from the war camp they need to go through. They see a light from the direction they came, so Vax and Scanlan stealth that way. Scanlan rolls a 1, so Matt rules that Scanlan was still humming to himself a little bit.
So, as you officially vanish into the ether and surrounding darkness, Scanlan, who still has that song stuck in his head from earlier, his slow jam is just abstractedly humming to himself without realizing it, calling a little bit of attention.
This is something I have a lot of complex feelings about, as far as whether a low roll means you did a bad job or just got unlucky. We're going to revisit this later, but just know that for now, this was a very common explanation for low rolls at the beginning of Critical Role. They see that this light is coming from a gnome cleric following their path.
Familiar female gnomish voice.
Hi.
Hey guys! It's me, Pike!
Jeez, where have you been?
Oh man, I've had quite a time.
It's the final member of Vox Machina, Pike. So here's a lesson right up front. We are less than 4 minutes into the game, not counting the recap. And the player who has been absent has now been reunited with the party, which means Matt made this priority number 1. This is a really wise decision because an absent player is usually already kind of bummed that they've been missing sessions at all. So unless there's a compelling reason, I don't think it's good to have them sit off to the sidelines any more than they already have. Now, if the DM and the player can coordinate for a cool way to introduce the character, that's one thing. But if everybody already knows the player is back, and everybody already kinda knows how the player's character is going to return to the party, then there's usually no reason not to just reunite them right away. Also, Pike briefly mentions a vision that she had, but doesn't get into it yet, so we're going to come back to this in a little bit. They all make camp, and Clarota tells them what he knows. And here's a lesson. Watch for it in the clips. Matt glances at his notes, but he keeps looking up to make eye contact.
7 years since I discovered my curse. My form was struck with the brand of the arcane. And these foul arts proved difficult to conceal.
He's clearly referencing something he's written, but it doesn't feel like reading.
I was severed from the elder brain, and chased on threat of death should I return.
Based on what he says later during the Q&A at the end of the episode, I'm inclined to believe that Matt wrote bullet points for the information Clarota knows, rather than writing this out as a word-for-word monologue. But both are possible.
Reading the surface thoughts of the deep dwarfs I encountered in the following weeks, I found a shift of power. Whatever had taken this hold had now demanded fealty of them.
And as a DM, you might feel at some point that you need to write something out word for word, because that might be the best way to get it right and communicate something to the players. I get it. I do that for this channel. I write scripts because bullet-pointed outlines are not enough for me anymore. But being able to still make eye contact while reading from word-for-word notes is a skill that you can learn. It just takes practice.
Not but 4 months ago, one of my estranged people was captured by these ash-skins and brought within the obsidian walls for what I assumed was interrogation.
Try to glance at a sentence and then make eye contact with your party the way the NPC would. Try to glance at a sentence in your notes and then look back to the party and deliver the information the way that the character would. That doesn't mean you have to use a character voice. That's a topic for another day. But don't just read it if you don't have to.
The fighting stopped, and the colony allowed the Ashskins to waltz directly into the temple, unharmed, unchallenged, where our elder brain resides.
I've played in games, especially from pre-written adventures, where whenever the DM had to read from something written word for word in the book, the tone of the game completely changed. Because the DM no longer felt comfortable, because they didn't write this material, they didn't write this dialogue or this description. They were just reading the box text. And when your DM has their eyes glued to the paper and they're just reading things off to you, it's really hard to absorb the information because it's not engaging. And fun fact, sometimes that DM was me. It took a lot of practice to get to the point where I could read the box text from an adventure module in a way that I still felt I was presenting the information in an interesting way and in a natural way. But now it doesn't scare me off. This is one approach, but this is not the only approach. Sneak a glance at the note and then make eye contact with your party and deliver the information to the party.
Now, a terrible army is forged of both factions, and they walk under the banner of this Kavar.
You can practice it yourself. Take a bit of dialogue. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be anything. And then practice it as if you're delivering it to the players. Retype it or rewrite it into whatever format works best for you. Put your finger next to the line you just read so you don't lose your place. And whenever you practice, because it's going to take multiple tries to get comfortable with this, use something different. Use a different piece of text. Use a different quote of dialogue or whatever it is. Use a different speech. That way you're not learning to memorize one specific piece of information, one specific description. You're honing a new skill. So anyway, coming back to the recap, this is what we learned from Clarota. He was cast out of his hive for developing innate arcane magic. Kavarn, whatever that is an entity that took over the Duergar. Then the Duergar marched on the Mind Flayer city of Yogg-Varil, and then Kavarn took over the Elder Brain, the center of the hive of the Mind Flayers. Clarota hopes that saving the Mind Flayers will mean that he is welcomed back into his hive. Right now, Clarota's helmet shuts him off from the hive, and it would take weeks to create something like that for the rest of the party to protect them from Mind Flayers and from something like Kavarn. And he assures them that if they free the Mind Flayers are not going to launch an assault on the surface world. The party reads him as honest, if a little bit crazy and a little bit desperate. They ask him some questions, and they're able to determine that the best way to fight a Mind Flayer without being vulnerable to its attacks is for the Mind Flayer to not know that you're there and not know you exist. He also says that if he gets access to the Duergar general, who was hanging out with the Mind Flayer that they saw in the last episode, he can get information out of that general that could be really beneficial to all of them. Then, Pike tells the party about her vision.
I was pulled down toward the mines, into the tunnels below where the dwarves were working.
Through the lake?
Well, past the goblinoid creatures and past a great underground lake. Past a jagged onyx-colored fortress framed in molten rock. Past a field of broken glass and bone. Have you seen any of this?
I'm thinking Onyx.
Those last things sound terrible.
No, the lake is the... Yes, that all sounds shitty. The last thing we've seen is the lake.
Here's a big lesson, and it's one of the biggest lessons in this episode. Players who miss a session can feel left out or confused or like they're falling behind. So when that happens, when you have an absent player returning to the party, give them something cool like this. And now they have information that no one else does. And this helps them feel more valuable. So the party debates which route they should take. Should they go down past this underground lake where they know there is an aboleth, or try to get through the Duergar Warcamp? The party generally decides, let's go through the camp, and you probably guessed that. The title of the episode is Attack on the Duergar Warcamp. Then they take a long rest in the Goblin Village, and they feel a rumble beneath their feet. This is the same tremor they felt when they took a long rest in episode 3. But then it was far away. Now they're a little bit closer, and they have to roll a stealth check.
Clarota, do you know what that rumbling is?
There are many creatures that live in this rock. Your best to be still.
Ooh, still.
Still.
They make a group stealth check, and the party barely passes. Barely. We'll do more videos in the future about random encounters and how to use them in your game, but that's what this is. It's a random encounter. And it's great because instead of a monster bursting out at them, there's a warning sign and then there's a roll associated with avoiding this fight. It was also foreshadowed in the last session, but then it was too far away to actually affect them. So this sends another message. They're deeper now, and they are closer to danger. This doesn't just build tension by reminding the players how careful they need to be and how this environment is dangerous in and of itself, not counting the villains they're facing. It also acts as a form of world building. Something digs through the ground in this area, and now they're in its hunting ground. So the party settles on a plan. They are going to sneak over to the war camp on their flying carpet and land on one of the buildings. Then Vax and Scanlan will sneak in with a bucket of pitch while invisible. Scanlan will use that tar, that pitch, to blind the Illithid, and then Vax will come in and strike it. That way it can't attack them psychically, and then Vax can attack it. Here's another quick lesson. The party doesn't have pitch. They don't have tar. So Vax asks if they can find some in the ruins of the Goblin Village, or something that can be used that way.
Well, I need to take a moment to find some. I'm going to look around and see if I can find any pitch.
Now, Matt probably didn't consider it likely that goblins use tar as part of their construction. Their buildings are a little bit more rudimentary in construction. And even if they did, the Duergar probably would have taken the tar with them. That's a valuable supply, especially if you're getting ready to do, like, war stuff. But instead of just saying no, which is boring, Matt says there's stuff in the Goblin Village that they could use to substitute pitch.
Oh, I got the exact same number. It's a 12.
Well, okay. Takes about an hour. You manage to find essentially a few piles of rather disgusting, sticky goblinoid refuse.
Sticky, disgusting goblinoid refuse. Which means this entire plan to take down the party's first mind flayer that they're going to kill hinges on the party carrying around a bucket of goblin poop.
That, you imagine, would probably stick and burn pretty well in a
Goblin
pitch type way. Yeah,
shit.
you find just a whole bunch of goblin shit.
Let's cook it up a little.
Sometimes, a lot of times, it's just so much more fun to say yes to the players, because then you get moments like this that are just so wonderful and so uniquely D&D. The party flies over and they see siege engines being built in the war camp. A reminder that this is where the assault on Craghammer would launch from. They fly over and the rest of the party waits on one of the buildings. Vax and Scanlan turn invisible and go down into the building. They successfully blind the Illithid with, yes, the goblin poop, and it psychically screams in all their minds, and Clarota turns to the ones on the roof and says, now.
You slink it behind, seemingly unnoticed. There's a slight twitch to the Mind Flayer's head for a second as you go ahead and take a big old
bucket of shit
and fling it. As the Illithid turns with its eyes wide to see you suddenly appear, and then suddenly see this entire batch of thick goblin shit just across its face. Suddenly you see its tentacles writhing as it goes, and as it screams, all of you hear in your head a scream.
I'm stabbing.
As this happens, you start cast Stone Skin, you go in for the blade, and you hear a counter voice in your mind.
Fuck.
Clarota, go.
This effectively gives everyone on the roof a chance to do one single action. Tiberius casts Stone Skin on himself, and Keyleth and Pike both cast Daylight on some objects. Now in this version, the party does not get a surprise attack, because the surprise attack was the goblin poop on the Illithid. But they still get to benefit from the fact that they knew there was going to be a fight, they just didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. It's a really smart compromise, and it still lets the players have a little bit of preparation without getting an entire round to completely unload on all these other monsters.
Stone Skin, light on his head, he's going into a rage.
Daylight on my shield.
Daylight on your shield.
I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, and Vax completely ganks the Illithid and takes it down very quickly. So the combat breaks out. Some PCs hold their initiative for another point, but that's not how 5th edition works, but they'll figure that out another time. Don't worry about it, it's fine. The Duergar general enlarges his body, which is something that Duergars can do. They can grow in size, but it is an action. And then he attacks, which would also be an action. So technically he doesn't have the action economy to do this, but it's fine. It's cooler this way. Plus, Matt has 8 players at this point, so he has to cut loose. And also, it's so undramatic for a Duergar to get large and then just end its turn. I'm not saying there's no reason in the rules that it is an action, and I'm not saying you should always let Duergar do that for free, but, you know, it's pretty cool. Also, the general ignites a flaming hammer. That's partially relevant as well. If Matt had actually ruled and written out in his notes that in his version, the Duergar enlarging was a bonus action, igniting the hammer would also be a bonus action. So he still is fudging something at some point in the process to make this moment as cool as possible. And it's a good thing he did, because it is cool. I mean, half the reason I'm describing this is so that you have a visual and know how cool this general must look while attacking the party. He's towering over the others. He's probably about the same size as Grog at this point. I mean, technically he's larger because he's a large size category at this point. He's got a flaming hammer, and he's making attacks. This is cool, and like the rules should not get in the way of this cool moment, in my opinion. And also Matt Mercer's, if that means anything. The daylight that Keyleth and Pike cast on their objects is blinding the Duergar, giving them disadvantage on things. Technically, this is not how it works, because the spell Daylight does not actually function as sunlight according to the rules, but again, it's fine. Scanlan casts Dominate Person on the general, who surrenders, and then the fight ends. Except, no, it doesn't, because they feel another rumble beneath the ground. They roll another stealth check, and this time, they do really poorly. And a boulette, essentially a land shark, comes bursting up out of the ground in the middle of the battlefield, in the middle of this building, in the middle of the war camp.
As this is happening, you guys feel a familiar tremble.
Oh no. We have to be quiet.
In the ground.
DM is out of his mind.
Everyone make a stealth check.
Damn it.
And the rumbling kind of fades for a second. And with the cacophonous cracking sound, the stone floor beneath you splits open.
Yeah!
Right here.
Yes.
As a large,
What the
a large armored, four-legged creature comes bursting out of the ground around you.
So the fight resumes, everyone gets involved again, and Scanlan has to banish the general with the banishment spell. The boulette knocks Scanlan unconscious, and Pike heals him, but of course, that means the general is back. Now, in order to reach Scanlan and heal him, Pike has to, at one point, scale something high, which means an acrobatics check. And Matt rules that Pike has disadvantage because of her heavy armor. But you don't need to do that. The ability to move in the armor at all is already determined by whether or not Pike is proficient in the armor. So the only roll that should be at disadvantage is stealth. Now you might be thinking that I just spent a bunch of time explaining why it's good that Matt changed or ignored some other rules. So now I'm criticizing Matt for this one? Doesn't that make me kind of a hypocrite? Technically, yes, Matt can do whatever he wants with the rules. If he wants, he can rule that Pike has disadvantage on her acrobatics checks. He can do that, it's his world. But to me, this is actually part of a larger discussion about what message your rulings send to the players. Having the Duergar general do all of his cool stuff on his first turn is great, because it gives the party a chance to see him in action. Part of why they're playing the game is so that they can fight cool monsters, and having a monster do cool things helps fulfill that fantasy. Also, at some point, they're going to cross paths with more Duergar. There is a Duergar fortress somewhere in their future. So they should probably know that Duergar have the innate ability to get really big. Having the Daylight spell give Duergar disadvantage on things is fine because it helps the players feel cool. And it also encourages the players to keep interfacing with the lore of the world and using that to their advantage. Yes, technically, the Daylight spell does not actually simulate sunlight, and that is dumb, and I don't think it should work that way. But they discovered by listening to Clarota and rolling their own skills that Duergar do not like sunlight. They are employing the information that Matt gave them, so he rewards them. Also, it is actually completely bonkers that daylight does not function like sunlight. I get why mechanically, but it just means that spell is really poorly named. And besides, disadvantage is not a huge deal when fighting these minions, these soldiers that are Duergar. It's not like they're fighting vampires, where the difference between daylight and sunlight actually means a lot more, because actual sunlight deals damage to vampires and limits their ability to heal. But when we're talking about the armor, telling the party that your cool armor makes you worse at everything, not just the stuff that's in the book, it doesn't actually send the same signal as those other rules that he ignores. It limits them. It makes them feel less powerful and cool. And again, if that's the tone you're going for, that's fine. It is your world and it's your game. And if you think that's more realistic, that's up to you. But I just think you should know the impact that is going to have on your players and how they feel during the game, because it makes them feel a lot less like heroic fantasy characters. It also might restrict how much they feel they can move around on the battlefield, which can lead to static fights and reluctant clerics, which is not a ton of fun for everyone at the table. And I don't think it's a coincidence that no other main character on Critical Role has worn heavy armor since Pike. This is the signal that you send when you make heavy armor have a larger consequence. I mean, part of this is because of stealth checks. They actually were a big issue in Campaign 1, but there can be larger unintended consequences for punishing behavior of certain types that you don't intend. Anyway, Percy gets knocked out during the fight as well, but Grog is able to kill the boulette by ripping its tongue out. And that's where the session ends. Percy is unconscious, and there's a bunch of Duergar still standing, including the general, who hasn't actually been taking a lot of damage because he was charmed, and then he was banished. Now, the episode does not end there. There's a Q&A at the end with some of the cast. And maybe one really valuable thing that we learned from the Q&A as Dungeon Masters is why the group switched over to 5th edition. First, there was obviously better brand recognition when it came to launching a show on a streaming platform. But second, with 8 players, he felt that Pathfinder got bogged down with a lot more floating modifiers. And regardless of your feelings about that system or how it works in combat, he felt that that would not be very fun or interesting for an audience to watch. Plus, he felt that when they have guest stars, the process of creating characters for 5th edition is a lot easier. So let's recap the lessons that we learned. It's really nice to get your absent players back into the game as quickly as possible. Try to deliver exposition in a natural way by keeping your eyes on the paper as little as you can. Give your absent players something else that connects them to the adventure, ideally something that no one else has. Visions of upcoming dangers and locations are great, but they are not the only option here. We saw a little bit how Matt's random encounters are used to enrich the environment, and add a sense of danger without feeling completely random. We talked about the value in ignoring some of the rules that Matt ignored in this game, and the potential unintended consequences of other rules changes. Next time, we are going to talk about Episode 5, The Trick About Falling. I know there's some of you who want to know this at the end of these episodes so you can watch along with me. I think that's really cool. And I think it's also kind of a smart way for me to let you know whether or not you should check out certain episodes, or whether you should skip them because something in them is frustrating or problematic, or maybe not that interesting. But this next one, Episode 5, it's a good one, so if you want, you can check it out. Either way, I'll be back here in 2 weeks to talk about it. In the meantime, please leave a comment if any of the lessons we talked about in this video resonated with you. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe. I have new videos every Monday and Thursday. And make sure to hit the bell so you know as soon as these videos come out. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.